mimic the neurotransmitters that are responsible for making social connections comforting, tying parent to child or lover to beloved. And that somehow it just wasn't a drug to be this and gotten rid of and punished for or whatever, but to be understood. The brain also makes its own opioids that are better recognized for their roles in pleasure and pain, but are also critical to the formation and maintenance of social bonds. One 2004 study found that infant mice without certain opioid receptors did not show attachment to their mothers. As the United States tries to end the opioid crisis, which resulted in more than 100,000 overdose deaths, this biology offers important insight. America can't arrest its way out of a problem caused by the fundamental human need to connect.
There you go.
Yeah. Some of the biggest factors for opioid overdose are social disconnection and using alone. So just increased loneliness, and loneliness is not spelled out. It may not be loneliness and look like loneliness in the others, but it's a relationship to an aloneness that somehow the loneliness is a social connection of continuity. There's a fear attached to it because it then throws you into an aloneness. And on the way to the experience of aloneness, there's many dimensions of fear because all of those affect how you're living. Every experience of it affects the literalness of how you're living. As you experience it deeply enough, and it goes past the personal loneliness in relationship to the rest of the social fabric, you visit a space that creatively one would try to reach, but somehow has to be reached at the ending of effort, where in fact you see that there is a space inherently in the life, in the story, and that the deeper you're with something, out of exploration or wonder or interest, the more is revealed. And as it's revealed, it no longer is limited to its literalness. And so your eye sees, not in a knowing way, not in a possessive way, but in a creative way. It sees inherently in the situation, the literal situation, the evocative situation, the many levels. So in that world, opinion is not so important. That's one of the expressions available to you. But if opinion blocks the exploration or the creativity, then it usually becomes violent. Because you start to see, well, let's say when some form is essentially falling apart, and you could see almost the particles of it are falling apart or rescattering to the people in it, since they have a literal situation, it's falling apart. If you saw a Shakespearean play, you would see the falling apart as part of the creative process. But he gathered the falling apart from observation of the world, and he saw that everything that was continuing was also falling apart. Whatever field you were in, from a religious field to a scientific field to a psychological field to just painting something, you saw a dissolution of form. If you were literally in it, you saw it as falling apart or fear or this or that. But if in fact you were evocatively or creatively in it, you saw the disassembling of form, the shifting of things through time, where the people themselves are not literally aware that they're in flux, almost as if they were in a breeze or a wind. That's what flux is in their life. It's shifting, and yet the day-to-day looks literally the same. So they measure that through time. This happened in time, but now we're having a vantage of seeing time 100 years ago in a show on TV or something, or 1,000 years ago. So now we have a period where we're mushing time as a factor, because it seems to me that whether it's the virus or not, or just came about at a certain time for all of us, that it did seem to reveal then, the virus collectively seemed to reveal a world up in the air. A world that did not have, if it was going to be measured by humanity, did not seem to have an agreement. Hello, Urja.
Hello, Danny.
So we were discussing some article in the paper where a woman who was discussing opiates, they were seeing that the opiates affected a place in the brain that was very much like the parent to child or lover to beloved. You know, that there was some, so it wasn't just addiction or dope or this or that, but it touched the same, it created some similar condition in the brain that had a kind of instant affection or touch automatically or something. And it gave, so then they were positing that the loneliness factor may be another factor in the opioid use, because it seems then that it gives a feeling of comfort or just at home with the bodiness. And I have experienced that, we'll say years, when I was a kid, and when we used all kinds of drugs, where you experience an at-homeness with one's life or existence with one's body. There was no distinguishing feature of it, but that at-homeness. You are who you are. And you inhabit this space. And so then another article that I was reading was this woman who just passed away today, and she wrote the book called The Good Divorce. The Good Divorce. That in fact, it may even be better than the marriage. Is the divorce, if it's an agreement with everyone included, that a good divorce is better than a bad marriage. This is what she was positing. Okay. And because in a good divorce, there is everyone is agreed that it's freed from the literalness, but you're still maintaining a family structure, each one. So that's applying logic. It's rare that that can happen. And because it's generally dependent on the feelings of the people, what they've come to. So in fact, what they're talking about in a marriage has memories, all these other things that may be released in a perception when something deeper happens for a moment, and you see the life from a different place, and then you see there was an integrity that ran through your story. And even though it broke up and it did this and it did that and it did this and it did that, somehow that's the outer story. When people who still have feelings for each other can't get away from each other, you know, with the feelings in literalness and close up or something, sort of denies the creative capacity of the feeling, where absence opens up another channel in the being. If the feeling is genuine, there is an opening in absence. So let's say the people in the story are aspects of the story, not the owners of the story. And they say, what would that mean? And they say, the trumpet doesn't own the tune that it's playing. You understand? But sometimes the trumpet has such nuances in it that it, you know, so they say, it seems then that the instrument owns the story, but as a matter of fact, someone's playing the instrument. So you get to meet the aspects of yourself that are there all along in your life while you're living it, but that you meet at certain times from a very different space. And then you see your own life in retrospect, but it comes from nonviolence, meaning non-possessive. The possessive tends to own the story in a way and dictate it, and so therefore it needs to be in a certain space to be able to see the soul of its own story, or the creative dimension. The creative dimension is not a possessive. and you see the soulful aspects of the story. We're just that dimension, the running through the story, you have access to in retrospect. And when it has a moment of perception, it humanizes you. You get to see the life from the perspective of the human being, not the self and the history so much. And so you see, human is a feeling that takes shape and form. And inherent in the human is information that is awakened as you come close to human experiences, and that loss, hurt, love, all of these touch upon it. And as they do, as you have the experience, they enter into the life somewhat. It translates literally around happy, being this or that. But you see, the underpinnings is that there is a conversation going on. And for that conversation to go on, one needs to have a full human experience. And no matter how one tries to devise an escape around the experience of being human, it's inherently waiting in the form. But not because it's an accident or because it's a punishment, but because one electively, when you see, why would a person pursue the broken heart? Why would a person do this when you can't talk them out of anything? They would lie and collaborate with it. And they even say that you're getting beaten by your husband. Why would they collaborate if the guy almost tried to kill you? But not only the social format that I'm talking about, but where you see a format has such obvious pain hidden in the story, not only psychological, but devoted to an experience. Then I say, okay, then you are seeing what it is. Not only the social dilemma, but there's a devotion to an experience inherently in the life. And I say, well, this is, but psychologically, I say, but the life has many dimensions to it. So on the surface, it seems a devotion to an experience that psychologically it shouldn't have. But creatively, you see the dimensions of its life is also creative. So at the same time, it should be avoided normally. You see there is something in the being that is not creating the experience, but wants to be there for the experience, not avoid it. And you see then, once you experience that much of the structure that you're in is based on an avoidance. That the continuity is the pressured formula and the basic fear. So you see the fear that enters even with a virus or this or that is that everything is up in the air. There's an up in the airness, and they're waiting for it to land, and we're waiting for it to land, so it has a logic again to it. But still there's an up in the airness to it, which doesn't exactly fit into the logic of continuity. And you see it trying to be organized, but there is a collective happening taking place, seemingly. Now, as you land in ground zero and people have identity and think who they are and what's going on, and they translate that into different forms that you're in, you navigate through the forms. You could see the political aspect, but we're not also captured politically. We see that's one fragrance of the story. But we still are experiencing a human being in a literal situation. And in being a human being in a literal situation, there's a navigation. There's a conversation going on in absence. There's an accidental meeting. There's this or that, but whatever form. Accidental only because it is no longer organized around the self. So the creative act comes out of the interaction to some degree. When there is a creative feeling and there's friendships that ensue out of it, the friendships themselves become an atmosphere or an immersive. When there is a mutual perception, we'll say, as with Urja and myself, or whatever, a period back where the perception of living and dying as the everyday, not as a horror movie or a scary movie or this or that, but the fact that the literal death frightened us from this exploration as human beings, just like the good divorce, what is actually happening. So you see, when there's an accident or you almost die or something happens, something is revealed that's been happening all along. And that your body has intuited, your brain has known, it tries to avoid falls, it does this, it has insurance, so somehow it is having a dialogue with death and dying. So it's not the dialogue of the social construct. It is the conversation that comes out of the perception of an experience, where you then see the dying and living almost as if you were a physicist, where you could see the parallel lives being lived simultaneously. You then see another dimension happening in the life, which is not so much based on time. So then you see the death doula is kind of hanging out around a similar perception. And that similar perception is like speaking another language. Or meeting a stranger who then speaks the language that you speak in the past. And you see that they're not a stranger at all in the similarity of the language. So you see that the perception of dying, entering into the everyday, then you'll have some folks who just glance at each other or say hello or converse, and it can vary across the board as to different situations that they're in. It doesn't have to literalize, because we're not talking about a medical condition. It may manifest as a medical condition, and that's what they see. But you see a kind of very weird magic that runs through the story.
Yes.
And you see that it was always living and dying. Every time it got hurt, every time it was happy, every time it had a parent, every time it was feared, every time it was in love, every time it was brokenhearted, it was always living and dying. And you could have taken its temperature throughout that time and see it's living and dying. And when I mentioned some aspects of the early Dr. Koshek, when you met him, he was always close to having a heart attack because of an asthmatic thing that would happen to him, especially traveling through America in the different climates and circumstances. And he was always living and dying in the circumstance. So he kind of was never spelled out, but living and dying somehow inherently ran through the story. And the dying had to do with how well one was doing, what was going on in life, whether one was in a love relationship or absent. Okay. So you saw then the threads of living and dying, where sometimes it was operatic and sometimes it was normal life. But once it was introduced to the life perceptively, it inherently ran through it. But it was not captured by thought, it didn't have opinion or whatever, but it was inherently your presence then brought a seriousness to the story by your presence, not a literal seriousness with questioning, but your presence had the perception of living and dying in it. And when you saw that much of the issues that were taking place, because the literal world was in fact always in this phase of living and dying simultaneously. And how it manifested socially and structurally and psychologically and environmentally, you see, all of it ran through the story. And you see, even if they're trying to get a question about climate control, living and dying is running through the story, They're screaming, "You're dying, we're dying, we're dying. You got to clean it up. You can't." And the other saying, "You're full of shit. You're full of shit. Be happy. Stop being so morbid about it." Hmm? And so then you say, "Okay, not that you're dying somewhere and like that. You're dying." And I say, "Why?" Let's say you're smoking all the time, and you see the guy dying. So then the guy says, "Look, let's make some plans for next year." And I say, "No, no, you're dying. I don't know if you can make plans for next year." Okay. Can you say that? You don't know. This chain smoking that you're doing, you don't know if you can make plans for a year. Why don't you make plans for 3 months? It would be if you want my diagnosis, you got 3 months at a time. Don't make plans more than 3 months. You can renew it in 3 months. I say, because basically it's not the smoking is causing it. I think the smoking is part of your dying process. I think it's almost a plan. What looks like a mistake and a flaw and stupid or whatever looks almost so brilliantly planned that the person would smoke no matter what, no matter however smart they were, whatever education they had, whatever background they had. And so then I say, okay, the ones I knew, whatever level they were on, when smoking was popular at that time, boy, oh boy, almost everything smoked, didn't it? In India, when you saw all the hippies in India, they all smoking BDs and this, but smoking.
In England, they
Even if you
smoked
didn't
in
like
the.
smoking, even if you didn't like smoking, you smoked. It was part of the culture. So then another thing that I just came across was the facial diagnosis and cell salts, and then some nice pictures of noses and eyes and lips and stuff like that. And they tell you,
Oh, that looks interesting.
what's happening for you. Now, I think we used to do this with, it's the cell salts. So it's a homeopathic. Again, the premise of the homeopathy is to look with deep interest at something, and or to listen with deep interest to something, and it starts to reveal itself from different perspectives, from the literal to the evocative. And they say, "Well, what do you see?" And they say, "Well, you see that almost everything then draws on is attempting to have a conversation with the invisible." And there are moments, you see, where somehow the creative dialogue is a conversation with the flow, while the day-to-day living is intending to have a continuity. The creative exploration is to explore the flux, a life in flux. And so to be able to see a life in flux is then to have a change in your whole impression of existence in some sense. You see the literalness on what level it is, and it's almost the literalness of your life is kind of related to gravity. The premise that there is a force of continuity, and so therefore you see that continuity becomes the force, planned continuity becomes the force in some way. And you see then that the individual is left out of the larger plan to some degree, and is always subject to the larger plan that it's what the larger plan of the parents have in store for the child. The child doesn't know that the parents want them to get a job in California somewhere. Okay, like that. So it seems like the child, maybe the child does know after a couple of months, they start to know that you want them to get a job in California or something. Because as I told you, the crazy stories of seeing beggar families in Asia and seeing to some extent where they raise their kids to be beggars and distort their bodies sometimes. And yet if you say, hey, don't do that, they would fight both with you because that's part of their development. And it's, as it seems, almost like a college education, that you have broken limbs enough so that you're a good beggar, and it looks like you've graduated. But then seeing it from the perspective of being inside the story, literally, where that's your life, you don't see, you think that the people are free from your perspective. But then once you enter into the story, you see that their story becomes increasingly logical from where they sit, that they're missing your perception, that somehow you're free from it, you're not dependent on it. So dependent on a construct of continuity allows one to accept what to a free person would be brutality. And that is the ownership of the child in a way where one is caring for, then it becomes then a medium of survival itself and attachment. And so then you see that why certain, if you looked at it and then you put together a certain principle for humanity, you would say you do not own your children. You're caring for them. Okay. So then you say, okay, but in a world that we live in, that people die and hurt and are inhumane and so on like that, then our perspective of children is pure. As you visit these places, your perception of children then are literal, that they're objects, they're this or they're possessives or this or that. Their names are so pronounced, their structures are. So, but you see also that there's an essential freedom, even whatever construct that the person in, there is a yearning. There is a yearning for a true experience. And it's not exactly laid out, but it does make, when it starts to emerge in the person, it does make one restless with the situation they're in. Because it then has them ask the fundamental questions of a circumstance that they took for granted. And that fundamental question releases the story. It's not an answer to a question, it is a realization of something. That then you see that somehow the energy that it's allowed you to live thus far has not only been a literal workaday attitude, it has been a relationship with a creative energy. And that creative energy has been the life that you've been living. But your access to it comes from a pure place. If you need to utilize it literally to earn a buck or do this or to survive, then it literalizes the circumstance. But the deeper you see it, the deeper you see an energy running through the life story. And then you see throughout time, the energy assumes a name or a form. It becomes this religion or that form or whatever. But anytime it becomes literalized as belief, it loses contact with the creative process. And I say, why? Because when you perceive it deeply enough, then you get why why it was so naive that they made statues of these people and this and that. When you perceive it deeply enough, you perceive your own life as Mary or Jesus in one sense, that you're having a conversation with yourself, and that's representative an aspect of your life. But other than that, on the story, they were people. But as they were people, they did things that forced them to reflect on a deeper life. But it wasn't a deeper life then, it was a fearful life to reflect on. But then you saw hidden in plain sight with dimensions in your own life that one had access to creatively. It had no use. The dynamic of spirituality has no literal use. But coming from the experience, one re-enters the story. That re-enters the story with you. So I feel that you then perceive living and dying from the get-go, just as if you perceive night and day. And so you start to make a similar logical plans for night and day as you do for living and dying, the simultaneity of it. It's second nature to you. So what we are saying is, creatively, a perception enters into one's life story. It doesn't mean you don't get scared when your neck hurts and it's about when you feel it coming and going. In fact, I think even the fear of it is the one won't say, no, I want to be able to fear it also. And I say, why? I don't know. I'm feeling what would have been a scary experience, or now you kind of want the whole experience. So it's not as if it's self-punishing. But then what is the experience like then? If in fact you say, I'm not warding off the fear, and they say, it's like watching a scary movie. It's not really fear. It's the scary movie is touching on a nerve in you. And so you see then that the issue is also touching on a nerve in you. And you start to see elements of simultaneity around you. You start to see the creative process of your own concerns, mental concerns and structures. And as a matter of fact, you'll see some Netflix that has almost a mirror reflection of some things that you'll be going through in the moment. We watched again, but I had suggested to you, but sometimes it's pretty tough. Better Things, with the woman in Hollywood growing up with the three girls.
Oh, yes, I like it.
I still haven't seen it, but
so we stumbled upon it again there, and there's 4 seasons of it, I think, or whatever. So we were goofing with it, and but you have to see it alone first. What do you think?
Alone?
But some aspects the kids would really groove with, because some of the kids are just like really sharp and on the ball.
Yeah.
And creative. But they say, "Come on, Ma, stop it already. You're old." Just saying, stop it. Get a boyfriend. Okay, they may tell her stuff like that, and then they cry and they empathize with her, and so it's very weird. Maybe it's our own goof, but we're seeing it again. The acting of these young children was remarkable. So that's what I'm seeing there also. So that's facial diagnosis and self experiences. Although it's not bad, there are some tips in there that are not bad. I don't know. Let me see. Doctor started to experiment at one point where people sent their clothes over, and he was using the sense of smell to diagnose. In India at the time. So I guess he can tell if something was coming close to dying, or what the illness was, or whatever. They were familiar enough with the population. How are you, Derek?
Doing okay. Thanks, Danny. Good to see you.
What's been happening then? Has anything literally been happening, or has it just been this still unfolding happening?
Just living the sort of day to day, and we had a gathering on Sunday, John's students and everybody, and then Reed came over also, and we all played some music, and that was nice. Nice to meet people who we hadn't met yet, who were students of John's and all of that. So,
well, Reed never met John.
No.
You see, you have to understand that we're kind of witness to 10 or 15 different movies that came out of our circumstance. So the Reed did not share the Santa Fe experience. When we left in Santa Rosa, then the folks that were in Santa Rosa went their way. Some then came here and recreated something else, but then others went their way. And again, like here, married each other in some cases and created a life for themselves or whatever. So to some extent, I was in touch with much of what was happening in that. But like in Boulder, I would go up there to help out if something happened or something like that, to shed some light on it or whatever. So that Reed has just come back into the story somewhat.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he does seem to be visiting those who are dying or hurt or seeing what's going on with the past story or whatever. And has created something. So he seems to be a sweetheart. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
So we kid around that way where there is that feeling there. There were things I wanted to discuss. And how, so you said that you were also continuing to try the mushrooms and the acid?
Yeah, the microdosing.
Microdosing, yeah.
Yeah.
Does that mean your own dosing at home?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Basically, I had gotten it to a point where I could get it to the right kind of space, where it wasn't onset or high, but it was just sort of tickling something. Uh, so I've been working with that for a little while.
Well, I would say that what my feeling was that what was actually happening, as we just saw when we saw that the opiate actually, in certain amounts, the opiates resembled a feeling of affection or trust or love, or as they say, between lover and beloved. That's pretty heavy, or between child and parent, a trust that somehow it excited a similar place in the body and in the brain. And I remember that being so, that somehow, whatever your circumstance, even if you were starving, somehow if you used a heroin sort of thing, it comforted you. You could be in the lowest situation. And many times you were in the lowest situation in terms of the rest of the social situation, And yet, with that, any circumstance that you're in was somehow, you could be shot, you could be anything like that happen, and somehow it touched something in you that relaxed you. Now, there may be another doctor who knocked you out, but before then, it seemed to humanize you. So this article was rather interesting about what to do about crisis and opiate, everything, and to understand it a bit deeper. And why there may be a crisis in opiate use because there's a crisis in loneliness. And so in blaming the attempt to resolve it or reflect on it, then you then punish it and have it come. So that has been the traditional way, because maintaining status quo of continuity, it becomes the issue. But the full question of what is happening in life that you're in now, from the perspective not only of life you're now, but the guy you presume that will be there 20 years from now, looking in with the story with you, and you see how all of life is not only missing a wholehearted conversation, but is purposely missing a wholehearted conversation. It's strenuously avoiding, because it is not a literal selection. It is, in fact, a state that one is in that sees the story from another place. And the I forgives the story, not the self. The I releases the story from its whole. And when the story is released from its hold, not because of psychological quirk or training or this or that, but an actual event sheds light on something. And that shedding light on something is also correspondingly happening to you physically, where they could measure it happening in the brain while you're perceiving it. And more, as we saw, they're able now to see what's happening to your brain while you're on acid or while you're taking doses or whatever, what is actually flashing and taking place, and correspondingly what you'll see. And they are creating imagery where it's like as if you're walking through an open landscape of your own brain. But it's not your brain any longer in the same sense as a possessive, but it's like a room of yours.
Yeah, I like that.
where you see memory as almost as if you were looking in your closet and you see memory, or looking on the
Oh, I love
tabletop
it.
and seeing memory. And so then, therefore, memory then becomes a creative process for you,
Mm.
which it always has been. But somehow this stage of the life is illuminated. And that what you're caring for, when it's illuminated, is the creative process that runs through it. Not the literal is an aspect of it, but not does it own the story. But that you see the flux to be a creative aspect of the life, while there is an everydayness or continuum. You see again that, like seeing a film or hearing an orchestra play, you see the motion inside it is happening. While there's the literalness of the moment, you also see it's all contributing to a happening that's taking place and unfolding. And it is not the usual happening. It is almost a secret perspective that comes without motive. Because the dimensions that you're exploring are without motive. Not that motive is bad or good, but motive, the literal motive of continuity, has no place in certain dimensions of the creative life. And you discover the creative life is the normal everyday life that the world considers everyday. But you kind of re-enter from a different feeling. And it's more like you're visiting your own experience. And so in visiting your life, you're eager to have the full experiences that are waiting in it. What do you say, Erja? Is that possible?
Yes.
Or we'll see. But we're in it. Are you okay then, Kai?
Mm-hmm.
Is anyone else on, or is it us four here and Mary over there?
Let's see. We have Michael Bravo and John, and there are 4 people watching, but those are the 2 that have said hi.
So again, we've found a common everyday way to be in what I would call an immersive, where there is a perceptive sense of living and dying being part of the living everyday process. And that somehow perceiving in all things changes your relationship to the societal use of death as fear. And the things representing death is homelessness, losing your home, divorce, all these other, as also death fears, somehow resembling, as you hide from the fear of death, you also have fear of death being in the literal story that you're in. So death would be loss of circumstance or whatever, or fear of. So you see the underlying fear that entwines itself in the social fabric.
Yeah.
Where the social fabric has the premise that you need it to survive, and survival in its way, they may be right, but it's premising that that's the way to survive, as if there aren't a million expressions for a human being. Work for an expression may be one of them, but it is not the only literal reason of survival. So let's say that one has the experience of being human where you enter into the story. And from that, you enter into it from the human perspective. And you see then literal work in the world then for you becomes a creative expression. Not a contractual one of continuity, but there's an experience in it. There's an aha moment when you come from the naive energy into the story. There's also discoveries in the world that everyone took for granted. And that discovery sometimes is a face in the crowd, a look across the room, but a relationship that comes not through motive or background or history or through story, but somehow you start to see creative dimensions of the life where you don't need to lie, you don't need to plan, you don't need to deceive. Those dimensions aren't important in that world. In fact, they're important that there's no truth. And then they say, why? And I say, because then you start to see that the existence is not a possessive. And the possessive dimensions of the existence have dumbed it down. Seeing it releases it. Doing something about it usually doesn't. Perceiving the story releases the story from its whole. Meeting your father in a cancer years later is not to meet your father, but to meet a human being who is doing a version of father. What everyone knew, what every neighbor saw, you discover. Discovery is different. Discovery changes the molecular nature of the circumstance, the particle nature of the circumstance. You meet a human who happened to be your father, and not the historical father, but you see parallel to your own existence, there have been these other existences. And they've literalized this history, but you discover something for a moment and you see you come from mystery. And you see that much of your life is hidden in history, but you understand its mystery. Where knowing is not the predominant feature, but experiencing it creatively is. And experiencing creatively is like adding another color to your palette. There's another range in it. It's like exploring a dimension that others would pass by, but that you would look at. And in looking at it, it reveals itself. And as it reveals itself, you see that time shifts. And as long as you are deeply in that shifting of time, in the exploration, you are making an agreement with something. It's almost as if there's a melody catching you and you have to explore it, almost as if you've come back from passing away and hang around for another year. I'm finding that's possible, not out of fear, but creatively, just as if you were making a movie or something, or you had something to write. Somehow, if you were writing something and you needed more time to hang out, the creative aspect of what you're doing, I think, can also create its own time. You discover a different time parallel to the time that we've thought of as normal. And you start to see that creative time is in fact more influential, that what looked like time on the news and time here and in the past or whatever, you see that in fact the past is not the past in the news. It is happening now. You see it's an immersive, it changes somewhat of the picture, but you see a similarity has always happened. There has always been some threat to the larger picture of human expression and continuity. And each aspect of it has a different look to it, but as you explore it, you start to see a similar thread running through it. And the fear of survival is organized into the structure as the reason for doing things. But inside the being, the reason for doing things, only survival is one aspect of it. When it's dominated by survival, it presses down the other dimensions of life and makes them sound stupid or, when in fact they're essential. What would that mean, Urja? You can do
It feels
it.
like survival is like almost stopping us from really being in the now.
Well, let's say for you, you can get a job if you have a boyfriend there. Then it wouldn't be a job. Then it wouldn't be a job. Sure, that would be nice to try that.
You mean he would give me a job?
No, I'm
Oh,
saying
you give me a job.
you would take a job if so the job with a boyfriend is a little different than a job with the survivor. You have someone to look at,
Yeah.
to talk to goof with. Okay. So
But
then you see
it's
it would
rare.
take away from the cold-bloodedness of survival and structure.
Yeah.
And you would start to say, no, that your feelings for each other is more important than them bossing you around. So you see, it would stick up for each other. It would create an environment. Just a dopey, affectionate love affair within the office would create an environment.
Yeah. Now that I'm almost
But have an
dying.
effect.
Right.
So you see that the job is not exactly a job. It is a creative act when it comes from a feeling. And so when it comes from a feeling, it won't do really cheesy things.
Right.
Anytime it comes from that feeling, the human enters into the expression. To some degree, there is a fear of the literal job world of the human entering into the story. Because eventually you get into many of these expressions and you start to see the inhumanity of them, what they're hiding, what their secrets. It's not only when you see in the news, they show you something for heart condition, and then they say, don't take it if you're this and that, this will happen to you. So it's such small print. And you see everything is in such, everything, your insurance policy, everything is in small print that the average person won't look at it or can't even see it anymore. Okay, whatever. And you see that life, way it's organized, is in small print. And even though you know it's there, you won't get a glass and take this out and see what it is. Basically, you trust its judgment. Once you see the small print is in fact hiding something that doesn't allow you an honest look at something, and that you are making a deal or making a trade-off and taking the pill or taking the thing, that requires some level of, okay, what's happening? So you can buy a year with this pill, but maybe you won't be able to walk after that. So there's a trade-off for it. Okay. Or whatever is happening, and you know the trade-off you're making. And you're buying time, or you're using it creatively or structurally, whatever. Let's say that there is a possibility to some degree in our interaction that one re-enters the story from freedom, from some degree of freedom creatively, where you see the dimensions of the world around you. And your relationship to flux, when you're in it but not of it, then you're not so governed by the conspiratorial theories. Do you understand? Because you see the life in flux.
Mm-hmm.
So you then discover when you see the life in flux, you become a stranger in a strange land in many situations. Because you see their conversation with each other realizes. When your life is not so literal any longer, your life is more of a creative act. Okay. I'm really glad we got to meet today.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anything else? I'll hope to see you all tomorrow. Shall we meet, Derek? Or Derek,
Sounds
should we
good.
meet tomorrow?
Yep, sounds good.
Oh, that's on.
Yes.
Okay, everyone. Namaste. Nice to see you.
Good to see you, Dan.
Thank you, Danny.
Hope everything's okay. Take care.
You too.
Bye.